Feudalism, a big part of the Middle Ages. Feudalism developed out of people's need for protection against invaders and landowners. The landowners need to defend their property. The feudal system grew out of the practice of clientage or patronage. Patronage had existed under the Roman Empire. These practices involved smaller landowners placing themselves under the protection of larger landowners, usually in exchange for payment or goods. In medieval feudalism, individual monarchs throughout Europe were unable to afford protection of their empires, so they gave trusted soldiers parcels of land in exchange for their promise to defend it and make it useful. So, land for protection. You give a soldier some land and they'll fight for you. Feudalism appeared in Europe during the 700s in the areas we now know as France and Germany, as weak governments sought solutions to the question of how to provide security with limited resources. By the 1000s, most of Western Europe participated some form of feudalism. So there's some parts to feudalism. We'll start with the top, the lord. He's the one who owns the land, usually a noble, although sometimes lords were bishops. The church owned a lot of land too. A vassal is a person, usually a soldier, who's given a piece of land by the lord. A fief is the land itself that is given. So the lord gives the vassal a fief. Manor, sometimes referred to in the context of the manorial system, was a basic unit of land, usually big enough for the supervision of a single knight or noble. And a serf. Though it technically translates as slave, the word serf, often used interchangeably with peasant, refers to a worker on the lord's manor, the slaves. Serfs weren't technically slaves, but they had no legal rights and were compelled to work on their assigned land. They were slaves. In most European feudal relationships, a power structure evolved that remained intact for several centuries. At the top of the pyramid was the monarch, who granted autonomous control over different parts of the kingdom to nobles. So he goes, here, you cover this area, you rule that area, you rule this area for me. Those nobles became vassals. They were given land, so now they had to support the king. So they became vassals of the monarch. In exchange for land, each vassal swore an oath of fealty or loyalty to the monarch. Although the nobles were powerful, they often subdivided their lands to the lesser nobles or knights, who then became the vassals of the noble in much the same capacity as the nobles served the monarch. The vast majority of people in the feudal system were peasants, very poor individuals who were responsible for tending the land. All of these relationships were based on exchange. The monarch granted land in exchange for management. The nobles granted land and protection in exchange for goods. The lesser nobles granted protection in exchange for goods. All levels of society were bound by loyalty to the level above them. The knights. Knights tended to be vassals of nobles. In exchange for land, they would swear an oath of fealty to the noble and agree to fight and protect them. Horses, heavy armor, and weapons were expensive, which meant the elite warriors usually came from the noble classes or were financed by them. There were two types of soldiers in feudal Europe: Common foot soldiers, usually the peasants forced into service, and knights, the elite warriors. The knights' training was rigorous and took a great deal of time. Boys were often chosen to be knights early in life so that training could begin. Milestones in a knight's life were as follows. At age 7, they served as a page, an attendant in the personal service of an individual knight, given basic lessons in horsemanship and basic hand to hand combat fighting skills. Think of this as elementary school. At age 14, successful students would be granted the title squire, which included sword privileges and increasingly difficult physical challenges and tasks, such as assisting a knight in battle. Think of this as middle school, high school. At age 21, they were formally qualified to become a knight. You've graduated. About the same time someone graduates college. Knighthood could be achieved in one of two ways. Usually, a squire would become would be knighted as a rite of passage at the end of his training. However, he could also be granted knighthood after a particular act of bravery. Knights were supposed to live by a code of behavior known as chivalry, which required them to remain loyal to their lords, fight with honor, treat all with justice, and act politely towards women. Although chivalry has often been celebrated and idealized in literature, popular imagination, many historians note that it wasn't universally practiced and its rules were often ignored. It was an ideal more than a practice, something to live up to, but it was rarely lived by. Knights like to do tournaments. It's like simulated war. Knights practice their military skills in exercises known as tournaments, mock battles that involved both real weapons and actual combat, though some tournaments outlawed points on swords. Tournaments ranged from small affairs with a handful of knights to grand staged affairs played out in front of large audiences. Rules varied throughout the ages. But as tournaments became more violent, the various monarchs of Europe sought to limit, or in some cases to ban, tournaments. Another popular sport in late medieval Europe was jousting, which involved two knights charging at each other on horseback and attempting to dismount one another with a long stick. Castles were centers of life for nobles and knights, serving as homes and fortresses. Building a castle was often a lifelong pursuit for nobles. Some castles would even take several generations to complete. Castles were usually constructed by serfs and masons. Masons are craftsmen who worked with stone. Once erected, these buildings would serve a number of purposes. First, there was intimidation. Castles were often built in the spirit of competition with other nobles, friendly or otherwise. A large castle could serve as a sign of a noble's strength, esteem, or power. Castles were often situated at the highest point in a region so they could be seen from great distances. Another reason for castles was military defense. Castles were mostly built with military use in mind. They had clever defense designs incorporating elements such as moats, large watchtowers, and very high walls. Castles were sometimes built on the outer regions of a noble's land as a means of encroaching on another noble's territory. Another reason for castles was residence to live in. Nobles and their families lived in the castles. The castles of the high nobles were often lavishly decorated, with rich tapestries on the walls, grand halls, and music rooms. Castles were dark, lit only by torches and fireplaces. The rooms were large and drafty because windows did not have glass in them. That's the end of today's lecture.